The kettle was whistling a tune that sounded suspiciously like a frantic seagull, but Alistair Thorne didn't mind. He liked seagulls. They had a certain honesty about them, a give me your chips or I shall scream at the sun kind of integrity that Alistair found refreshing in a world of subtle social cues. He lived in a small, slightly lopsided cottage in the village of Oakhaven-on-the-Wold, where the hills rolled so gently they looked like they were trying to fall asleep. Alistair was a man who believed that the universe was a giant cardigan, and we were all just loose threads trying not to get snagged on the coffee table of destiny. It was a philosophy that served him well, mainly because it allowed him to be quite clumsy without feeling personally responsible for the laws of physics. Today was a significant day. It was the beginning of the 7th flower season. In Oakhaven, this happened only once every 7 years when the Blue-Moon Marigolds decided they were finally in the mood to show off. These flowers were temperamental things, they required exactly the right amount of moonlight, a specific frequency of bee humming, and, according to local legend, a complete lack of sarcasm within a 3-mile radius. Right then, Alistair said to his cat, Barnaby, who was currently attempting to sit inside a shoe that was clearly too small for him. 7 years. That's 84 months. Or a lot of Tuesdays. If you think about it, Tuesdays are the middle children of the week. No one really wants them, but they're there anyway, making everything feel slightly grey. Barnaby let out a small, muffled meow from the depths of the brogue. Alistair smoothed down his waistcoat, a tweed affair that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old maps. 7 years ago, the marigolds had bloomed, and his life had changed. That was the year Beatrice Halloway had packed her leather suitcases, kissed him on the tip of his nose, and told him she was going to London to find out why the sky there was the colour of wet pigeons. I'll be back for the next bloom, she had promised. Alistair had spent the intervening years becoming a very good baker of rather wonky cakes. He had learned that if you put enough jam in the middle, nobody cares if the sponge looks like it suffered a minor geological event. He had also learned that silence is just music that hasn't found its instruments yet. He stepped outside, the crisp morning air of the Cotswolds hitting him with the scent of damp grass and anticipation. The village square was already buzzing. The Blue-Moon Marigolds were beginning to unfurl their petals, shimmering, iridescent things that looked like they had been dipped in starlight and then rolled in sugar. Oh! Look at that one! Alistair whispered to a passing ladybird. It's very blue. Almost aggressively blue. Like a very polite bruise. He walked towards the village green, his heart doing a strange little dance. It wasn't a waltz, it was more like a caffeinated jig. Was she here? Would she even recognize him? He had grown a beard in the 4th year, but he'd shaved it off in the 6th because a small bird had tried to build a nest in it while he was napping in the garden. Now, his face was just his face. A bit like a well-loved leather glove that had been left out in the rain once or twice. The festival was in full swing. There were stalls selling honey, stalls selling knitted tea cozies, and one stall selling philosophical pebbles, which Alistair suspected were just rocks from the river with "Y" written on them in permanent marker. He bought one anyway, because the pebble looked lonely. And then, he saw her. She was standing by the old oak, the one that leaned at a 45-degree angle because it was tired of standing up straight. She was wearing a coat the color of a sunset that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be pink or orange. Beatrice. She looked different, yet exactly the same. Her hair was shorter, cropped into a bob that made her look like a very sophisticated mushroom. She was squinting at a flower through a magnifying glass, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth, a habit she'd had since she was 6. Alistair's legs suddenly felt like they were made of overcooked spaghetti. He took a step, tripped slightly over a rogue dandelion, and managed to recover with a flourish that looked entirely accidental but felt very dramatic. "Beatrice?" he said. His voice sounded like it had been living in a dusty cupboard for a decade. She turned. Her eyes widened. They were the color of tea, strong tea, with just a splash of milk and a lot of secrets. "Alistair Thorne," she said, and the way she said his name made the last 7 years feel like a very long, very boring advert for a product he didn't want to buy. "You've still got flour on your eyebrow." Alistair reached up and rubbed his face. It's a decorative choice. Very avant-garde. It represents the fleeting nature of bread. Beatrice laughed. It was a bright, silver sound that made the Blue-Moon Marigold seem to glow a little brighter. You haven't changed a bit. Still talking nonsense as if it's the gospel truth. It's not nonsense, Alistair protested, feeling a warm glow spread from his toes to his ears. It's pseudo-philosophy. It's like real philosophy, but with more snacks and fewer long words. How was London? Did you find out about the pigeons? Beatrice stepped closer. She smelled of peppermint and something metallic, like rain on a bicycle. The pigeons are actually very misunderstood. Alistair. They're just trying to navigate a world that doesn't have enough crumbs. I spent 7 years looking at buildings that were too tall and people who were too fast. I realized that time in the city is like a hungry dog, it just keeps chasing its own tail. That's very deep, Alistair said, nodding solemnly. I once thought time was a giant hamster wheel, but then I realized that would mean we're all just hamsters, and I don't think I have the cheek capacity for that much lettuce. They began to walk together through the blooming fields. The marigolds were fully open now, a sea of sapphire and indigo that seemed to ripple like the ocean. I missed this, Beatrice murmured, looking at the flowers. The 7th season. Everything feels so deliberate here. Like the world took a deep breath and decided to be beautiful just for the sake of it. I missed you, Alistair said. He hadn't meant to say it so plainly. He usually liked to wrap his feelings in 3 layers of metaphors and a joke about a badger, but the words just slipped out. Beatrice stopped walking. She looked at him, and for a moment, the air between them felt very thick, like honey. I missed you too, Ul. Even when I was in a room full of people, I kept looking for a man who would tell me that the moon is actually just a giant hole in the sky through which the gods pour milk. Well, it is, Alistair said softly. How else do you explain the Milky Way? It's basic plumbing. They sat down on a wooden bench that was carved with the names of lovers from centuries ago, names that had faded into the grain of the wood. Are you staying? Alistair asked. He tried to sound casual, as if he were asking about the weather or the price of eggs, but his fingers were fidgeting with the philosophical pebble in his pocket. Beatrice looked out over the village. I don't know. The city is loud, Alistair. It's loud and it's bright and it makes you feel like you're constantly running late for a train you've already missed. But coming back, it feels like I'm a puzzle piece that's been slightly warped. I don't know if I still fit. Alistair looked at her. He thought about the wonky cakes he made. He thought about his house that leaned to the left. Nothing fits perfectly, B.A., he said, and for once, he wasn't trying to be funny. The earth isn't a perfect circle, it's a bit squashed at the ends, like an orange someone sat on. My cakes are lopsided, but they taste better because the jam pools in the corners. If you're a warped puzzle piece, that just means you're more interesting to look at. The flat ones are boring. Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, like a bird returning to its favorite branch. You're very wise for a man who once tried to teach a goldfish how to whistle. In my defense, Alistair said, the goldfish was very attentive. He just lacked the necessary pucker. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The Blue-Moon Marigolds began to shimmer in the twilight, their petals catching the first hints of stars. 7 years, Beatrice whispered. It feels like a lifetime and a heartbeat all at once. That's because time isn't a line, Alistair explained, waving his hand in a vague circle. It's a squiggle. A very messy, ink-stained squiggle. Sometimes the squiggle loops back and touches a part of itself it hasn't seen in ages. And when that happens, you get a 7th season. Beatrice squeezed his hand. Her palm was warm. I think I'd like to see the 8th season. With you. Alistair felt a surge of joy so intense he thought he might actually float away, which would be a problem because he hadn't brought an anchor. The 8th season? That's another 7 years. I'll be even more lopsided by then. I might even start wearing socks that don't match on purpose, just to rebel against the tyranny of pairs. I'll wear them with you, she said. As the moon rose over Oakhaven-on-the-Wold, casting a silver glow over the iridescent fields, Alistair Thorne realized that life wasn't about the destinations or the grand plans. It was about the people who were willing to sit on a wonky bench with you and look at flowers that only bloom when they feel like it. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if the sky was full of milk or if time was a hamster wheel. But he knew that the jam was in the corners, the tea was warm, and Beatrice was home. "Oh!" Alistair exclaimed suddenly, sitting up straight. "What is it?" Beatrice asked, startled. "I've just realized something very profound," he said, his eyes wide with mock seriousness. "If we're going to wait another 7 years for the next bloom, we're going to need a lot of biscuits. Like, a statistically improbable amount of biscuits." Beatrice laughed, and the sound carried across the quiet village a melody of pure, unadulterated hope. "I'll go put the kettle on, shall I?" "Yes," Alistair grinned. "And don't worry about the seagull noise. It's just the kettle's way of saying it's excited for tea." They walked back towards the lopsided cottage, two warped puzzle pieces moving through a world that was perfectly, wonderfully imperfect. The flowers swayed behind them, blue and bright, blooming in the quiet certainty that some things, the best things, are always worth the wait. "Alistair?" Beatrice called out as they reached the gate. "Yes, B.A.? Why is the sky blue?" "Truly?" Alistair paused, looking up at the vast, darkening canopy above. He smiled. "Because the universe is a bit of a show-off, and blue is its favorite color to wear when it wants to feel fancy." "I thought so," she said, and they went inside, leaving the door slightly ajar for the scent of the marigolds to follow them in. The 7th season had begun, and for the first time in a very long time, Alistair Thorne felt that the cardigan of the universe was perfectly, beautifully snug. No loose threads in sight. Just the warmth of a shared kitchen, the hum of a happy cat, and the promise of 1,000 more Tuesdays, each one a little less grey than the last. "Barnaby!" Alistair called out. "Get out of my shoe. We have a guest." And the world, in all its ridiculous, pseudo-philosophical glory, was exactly as it should be. The marigolds continued to bloom, the moon continued to pour its milk, and in a small cottage in the Cotswolds, two people began the very serious business of being happy. "It's a good day for a scone," Alistair whispered to himself. "A very good day indeed." The floorboards of the cottage, which Alistair had affectionately named the thimble on account of its size and the general feeling that it was trying to protect something sharp, did not merely creak. They groaned with the weary resignation of an elderly butler who had seen far too many muddy boots and was frankly considering retirement. Beatrice stepped over the threshold, her boots clicking softly against the uneven stone of the entryway. The air inside smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and a very specific brand of pipe tobacco that Alistair had claimed was made from the sweepings of a wizard's library. It was a smell that wrapped around her like a heavy, hand-knitted jumper, one of those slightly itchy ones that you can't help but love because it's the only thing keeping the frost at bay. "Mind the rug," Alistair cautioned, dancing around a particularly frayed bit of tapestry that looked like it had been wrestled by a very small, very angry tiger. "It has a tendency to migrate. I suspect it's trying to find its way back to Persia, or at least to the kitchen where the crumbs are more plentiful." He bustled about, his long, spindly limbs moving with a frantic grace. He looked like a heron trying to perform a complicated folk dance in a telephone box. He flicked a switch, and the room was bathed in the warm, honeyed glow of several mismatched lamps, their shades tilted at jaunty angles as if they were sharing a private joke. "You haven't changed a thing, Alistair," Beatrice said, her voice soft. She ran a finger along the spine of a book titled The Secret Life of Clouds and Why They Are Generally Misunderstood. "Except, perhaps, there are more books." "And more. Are those clock gears in a jar?" "Ah, yes," Alistair said, peering into the jar with an expression of profound mystery. "I'm trying to catch time. It's very slippery, you see." I figured if I gathered enough gears in one place, time might get curious and wander in to see what the fuss is about. Once it's in the jar, I'll ask it why it insists on going so fast when one is enjoying a crumpet. It slows down to a glacial crawl during a dental appointment. It seems a very inefficient way to run a universe. He turned to the stove, where the kettle was already beginning to emit a low, rumbling hum. Now, then. Tea. It is the fundamental glue of the British Isles. Without tea, we'd all just be a collection of damp people shouting at seagulls. Do you still take yours with a cloud of milk and a suspicion of sugar? A suspicion? Beatrice laughed, leaning against the doorframe of the tiny kitchen. I think the last time you made me tea, that suspicion was more of a confirmed citing the dot. Quite right. Accuracy is important in chemistry and confectionery, he muttered, reaching for a tin decorated with faded scenes of the seaside. As he fumbled with the kettle, a ginger blur erupted from beneath a nearby armchair. Barnaby, a cat of immense girth and even greater ego, skidded across the linoleum and came to a halt by Alistair's left boot. He looked up at Beatrice with one golden eye and one eye that seemed to be permanently fixed on a distant, invisible moth. "Mro," Barnaby remarked. It was a sound filled with judgment. "Oh, hush, you orange loaf," Alistair said, nudging the cat gently with his toe. "Beatrice is a guest. She is not here to be interrogated by the local feline constabulary. And no, she hasn't brought any prawns. She's far too sensible for that." Beatrice knelt down, extending a hand. Barnaby sniffed her fingers with the intensity of a connoisseur examining a vintage wine, before deciding she was acceptable and leaning his entire weight against her shin. "He's gotten bigger," she noted, scratching the spot behind his ears that usually resulted in purring. "It's the gravity in this house," Alistair explained, pouring boiling water into a teapot that was shaped like a very surprised cottage. "It's much stronger in the kitchen. It pulls things down, crumbs, dust, cats. Barnaby is merely a victim of physics. He doesn't eat that much, really. He just absorbs the ambient stillness of the room." The kettle gave its promised seagull shriek, and Alistair expertly swirled the pot. There was something deeply comforting about the ritual. The clink of china, the steam rising in white plumes, the way the shadows danced on the walls. For a moment, the 7 years of silence between them felt like nothing more than a long afternoon nap. "I missed this," Beatrice admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The way everything here feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for a story to start." Alistair paused, a teaspoon halfway to the sugar bowl. He looked at her, and for a second, the mask of whimsical eccentricity slipped. His eyes, usually bright with mischief, were suddenly ancient and tired, filled with the weight of all the Tuesdays he had spent drinking tea alone. "The house was very quiet, B.A., he said simply. Even the clock stopped ticking for a while. I think they got bored of telling the time to a man who didn't care what hour it was. I had to bribe them with a bit of oil and a promise that something interesting would happen eventually." He straightened his waistcoat, the mask snapping back into place with a shaky smile. "And look! I was right. Something interesting did happen. You came back. Which proves that my theory about the universe being a giant boomerang is entirely correct. If you throw something out into the void with enough love, it eventually hits you in the back of the head on its way home." "Is that what happened?" she asked, stepping into the kitchen. "I hit you in the back of the head." Metaphorically speaking. It was more of a gentle nudge. A psychic elbow to the ribs. He handed her a mug. It was chipped at the rim, but the ceramic was warm and the tea was exactly the right shade of tan. "Here. Drink this. It's a special blend. I call it the Optimist's Infusion. It's mostly Earl Grey, but I've added a pinch of dried sunshine and a very small amount of hope I found at the bottom of a biscuit tin." They carried their mugs into the living room, which was less of a room and more of a vertical library with a sofa squeezed into the middle. They sat down, not too close, but close enough that their shadows overlapped on the floor. "So," Beatrice said, taking a sip. "The 8th season. Do you really think we can make it that far? 7 years is a long time to wait for a flower. Alistair looked into his tea as if the dregs held the blueprints for a better world. 7 years is only a long time if you're a mayfly or a very impatient piece of fruit. In the grand scheme of things, it's just a blink. The stars have been waiting billions of years for us to notice them, and they don't complain. They just keep shining, hoping that one day we'll look up and say, "Oh, hello. You're looking rather sparkly tonight." He leaned back, his head resting against the floral upholstery of the sofa. The problem with the world, B.A., is that everyone is trying to get to the end of the book. They want to know the ending, they want to see the happily ever after, or the tragic conclusion. But the best parts are always in the middle. The bits where nothing much happens. But the light is perfect and the tea is hot. That's where the magic lives. In the margins. Beatrice looked at him, really looked at him. He was older, certainly. There were more lines around his eyes, like a map of all the smiles he'd kept to himself. His hair was a silver thicket that defied the laws of grooming. But he was still Alistair. Still the man who believed that if you spoke to a stone with enough sincerity, it might eventually tell you a secret. "You're very wise, Alistair Thorne," she said. In a completely ridiculous, nonsensical sort of way. "It's the only way to be wise," he replied, closing his eyes. "If you try to be sensible, you end up becoming a person who worries about things like interest rates and the structural integrity of fences. And where's the fun in that? I'd much rather worry about whether the moon feels lonely or if the trees are gossiping about my choice of socks." He reached out, his hand finding hers on the cushion between them. His fingers were rough, calloused from gardening and turning old pages, but his grip was steady. "I'm glad you're here, B.A. Truly. The Marigolds are lovely, but they're terrible conversationalists. They mostly just talk about the weather and how much they enjoy being blue. It gets a bit repetitive after the first decade." Beatrice squeezed his hand. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the Blue-Moon Marigolds, sending a faint, ethereal glow through the windowpane. The 7th season was in full bloom, a miracle of timing and patience. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. "At least, not until we've finished all the biscuits. And you mentioned a statistically improbable amount, so I imagine I'll be here for a while." Alistair chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to settle the house into a deeper state of peace. Barnaby, sensing the change in atmosphere, jumped onto the sofa and curled into a ginger ball at their feet, purring with the rhythm of a well-oiled engine. "Good," Alistair whispered. "Because I've been saving a particularly fine packet of chocolate digestives for a special occasion. And I think a Tuesday evening with an old friend and a glowing garden qualifies quite nicely." As the night deepened over Oakhaven-on-the-Wold, the little cottage remained a beacon of warmth in the darkness. Inside, there was no talk of the years lost or the mistakes made. There was only the sound of the kettle starting to simmer again, the scratching of a cat's chin, and the quiet, pseudo-philosophical musings of a man who knew that life, for all its messy squiggles, was a very beautiful thing indeed, especially when shared with someone who didn't mind the wobbles. "Alistair?" Beatrice asked as he stood up to fetch the biscuits. "Yes, B.A.? Do you really think the sky is blue because the universe wants to feel fancy?" Alistair paused at the kitchen door, the light catching the silver in his hair. He looked back at her with a wink. "Well, it's either that or it's trying to match your eyes. But the universe is a bit of a romantic, so it's probably both." He disappeared into the kitchen, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby for a goldfish, leaving Beatrice to sit in the golden light, watching the blue flowers outside dance in the dark. She smiled, a small, secret thing. The 8th season felt a long way off, but for the first time in 7 years, she wasn't in any hurry at all. The jam was in the corners, the tea was warm, and the world was, at last, exactly the right shape. Alistair re-emerged from the kitchen with a tin that looked as though it had survived several minor wars and at least one significant fall from a high shelf. He rattled it with a flourish, the sound of hidden treasures clinking against the metal. "The Vault of Cocoa Delights," he announced, his voice carrying that peculiar, melodic lilt of a man who found genuine adventure in the mundane. Beatrice laughed. It was a light, silver sound, one she hadn't used much lately in the city of glass and grievances. "It's a biscuit tin, Alistair." A very dented, Victorian-looking biscuit tin at that. To the untrained eye, perhaps, he said, settling back onto the floral sofa with the grace of an old cat finding a sunbeam. But to a man of my refined sensitivities, it's a portal. Each biscuit is a small, edible promise that the world isn't going to end before tea time. And if it does, at least we'll have had the chocolate ones first. It's a very sound strategy for life, really. Always eat the best things first. Just in case a meteor decides to pop by for a visit. It would be terribly embarrassing to be hit by space debris while holding a plain Marie biscuit. He handed her a digestive. It was thick with dark chocolate, the kind that left satisfyingly messy marks on your thumbs if you held it too long. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic crunching and the low, contented hum of the kettle settling on the stove in the other room. "Why didn't you ever fix the gate, Alistair?" B.A. asked suddenly, her gaze drifting towards the hallway. "The bottom hinge. It still squeaks like a mouse with a very specific, long-standing grievance." Alistair looked thoughtful, his eyes following the faint, blue luminescence bleeding through the window from the garden. "I did think about it once. In the summer of the 4th year, I believe. I even went so far as to buy the oil. It was a very handsome tin of oil, quite shiny. But then I realized that if I fixed the squeak, I wouldn't know when the wind was coming to visit. The gate is my early warning system. It tells me when the breeze is feeling particularly adventurous or when a hedgehog is having a midnight stroll. If you make everything perfect, B.A., you lose the conversation. A squeaky gate is just the house clearing its throat before it tells you a story." B.A. looked down at her biscuit, a small smile playing on her lips. "I think you just didn't want to bend down that far, you old rogue." "Well, that too," Alistair admitted with a sheepish, lopsided grin. "My knees have reached a formal non-aggression pact with gravity. They stay down, and I stay up, and we try not to bother each other too much. It's a very civilized arrangement. But tell me, B.A., in that big, shiny city of yours, do the gates speak? Or do they just stand there looking important and expensive?" B.A. sighed, a soft sound that seemed to carry the weight of 7 years of concrete, deadlines, and lukewarm lattes. "They don't speak, Alistair. They're mostly electronic. You beep a plastic card, and they slide open with a sterile hiss. Like they're judging your outfit and finding it wanting. Everything there is so efficient. You don't have time to listen to the wind because you're too busy checking your watch to see if you're late for a meeting about how to be more efficient. It's like running on a treadmill that someone else is controlling." "Sounds exhausting," Alistair murmured, reaching out to scratch Barnaby behind the ears. The cat leaned into the touch, eyes half closed. "Like trying to run a race in a suit made of lead. Why do people do it? Is there a prize at the end? A golden trophy in the shape of a very stressed person?" "I thought there was," B.A. said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate and vulnerable. "I thought if I worked hard enough and ran fast enough, I'd find that important version of myself. The one who knows things and goes to places with names everyone recognizes. But coming back here, seeing you and these ridiculous marigolds, I feel like I just left my shoes behind and I've been walking on sharp stones for years without noticing. I'm quite tired." "Alistair." Alistair reached over and patted her knee, his touch as light and reassuring as a falling leaf. "Shoes are overrated. The soul likes to feel the grass, even if the grass is a bit damp and there might be a slug or two involved in the process. It's all part of the sensory experience. You can't appreciate the softness of the moss if you're always wearing leather soles." He stood up and walked over to the window, peering out at the blue glow that seemed to be intensifying as the night deepened. The 7th season was reaching its peak. The seventh season is a fickle thing, BA. It only comes when the world feels a bit tired of being merely green and brown. It's the universe's way of saying, look, I can do magic too, if I'm in the mood. Most people miss it. They're too busy looking at their feet or their bank balances. But you came back just in time for the show. BA joined him at the window. The garden was transformed into something out of a dreamscape. The marigolds weren't just blue, they were a shimmering, pulsating azure that seemed to hold the light of 1,000 fallen stars. They didn't look like flowers, they looked like memories that had finally found the right soil to grow in. They're beautiful, she whispered, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. They're preposterous, Alistair corrected gently. Completely illogical. A flower that blooms blue once every 7 years for no reason other than to look fancy? It's nonsense. And that's exactly why I love them. They don't have a job. They don't have a purpose. They don't provide a service. They just are. We could learn a lot from a blue marigold. BA. Mostly about how to stand still and look fabulous without worrying about the mortgage or the morning commute. He turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically serious for a moment, the lamplight catching the silver in his beard. I didn't wait for you, you know. Not in the way they do in those dreadful novels with the shirtless men and the dramatic rainstorms. BA felt a sudden, sharp pang of something. Was it disappointment? Or perhaps a strange kind of relief? I didn't wait, he continued, his voice soft, because waiting implies that life has stopped. And life never stops, even when it's just sitting in a garden chair. I just kept a space clear. I kept the tea leaves fresh. Because I knew that eventually, the city would run out of things to tell you. And you'd want to come back to a place where the gates squeak and the flowers are the wrong color. I wasn't waiting for you to come back to me, BA. I was waiting for you to come back to yourself. BA felt a tear prick the corner of her eye. It wasn't a sad tear, it was the kind of tear that happens when a knot you've been carrying in your chest for years finally starts to unravel. It felt like a thaw after a long, lonely winter. I think I'm almost there, she said, her voice a bit shaky. Good, Alistair smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening into familiar maps of kindness. Because the 8th season is apparently going to be purple, and I'm going to need someone to help me decide if it's royal purple or accidental jam stain purple. It's a very important distinction for the local gardening club's newsletter. He nudged her shoulder playfully. Now, back to the sofa. We haven't even discussed the sociological implications of Barnaby's obsession with the radiator. I have a theory that he's actually a small, ginger sun god in disguise. And the radiator is his altar. It's the only explanation for the way he demands worship every afternoon at 3 o'clock sharp. B.A. laughed, a genuine, Bella-deep laugh this time, and as she sat back down, the cottage felt like it was wrapping its arms around her. The blue light outside flickered, the wind whistled through the gate, and for the first time in a very long time, the middle of the book felt like exactly where she wanted to be. The night stretched on, comfortable and elastic. Alistair started a fresh pot of tea, Earl Grey this time, which he claimed was the sophisticated cousin of breakfast tea, the one who went to university and came back with a monocle and a questionable interest in existentialism. You know, Alistair said, peering into the teapot as if it held the secrets of the cosmos, I once tried to teach Barnaby to play the harmonica. I thought it would be a marvelous addition to our evening entertainment. Imagine it! A cat playing the blues while the blue flowers bloom. It would have been poetically redundant, don't you think? B.A. tilted her head, a stray lock of hair falling over her forehead. And let me guess. He wasn't particularly interested in the blues. He was deeply offended, Alistair sighed, pouring the tea with a steady hand. He looked at the harmonica, then he looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated judgment, and then he spent 3 days staring at the kitchen wall in silent protest. I think he felt it was beneath his dignity. Cats have a very high sense of status, you see. To Barnaby, a harmonica is just a very loud, metallic mouse that doesn't taste of anything. He's more of a cello enthusiast, I suspect. He has the posture for it. He handed her a cup, the steam rising in elegant, twisting ribbons. But that's the trouble with trying to improve things, isn't it? We're always trying to make the cat play the harmonica or make the garden bloom twice as fast. We forget that the cat is perfectly happy being a cat. And the garden is perfectly happy being dirt for most of the year. We're a very pushy species, B.A. We want everything to be more than it already is. B.A. took the cup, the porcelain warm against her palms. I think I was trying to be the more. I thought Beatrice the successful architect was a better version than just B.A. the one who likes old books and gets excited about a particularly nice-looking patch of moss on an old stone. Moss is excellent, Alistair said firmly. Moss is the velvet of the woods. It's very humble, very green, and it doesn't care about your job title or your LinkedIn profile. If you were a project manager for moss, you'd be very bored, because moss doesn't have deadlines. It just sits there, being damp and magnificent. There's a profound lesson in that, though I'm currently too full of chocolate digestives to remember what it is. He settled back into his chair, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lamp. Do you remember the old oak tree by the stream? The one we used to call the General because it looked like it was standing at permanent attention. Of course, B.A. smiled, her mind drifting back to childhood summers. We used to leave letters in the hollow of its trunk for the fairies. Or for each other, when we were being particularly dramatic about our teenage woes. The General fell last winter, Alistair said softly. B.A. felt a sharp, unexpected pang of loss. Oh, no. Alistair, I'm so sorry. That tree was. It was forever. It was the anchor of the whole meadow. That's what I thought, Alistair replied, his voice steady. I was quite distraught for a week. I even considered writing a strongly worded letter to the weather, but I couldn't find a stamp that expressed the right level of indignation. But then, a funny thing happened. The General didn't just disappear. He became a bridge. He fell right across the stream. Perfectly positioned. Now the foxes use him to cross without getting their paws wet, and a whole colony of mushrooms has moved into his bark. They've turned him into a sort of high-rise apartment complex for fungi. He's more popular now than he ever was as a tree. He looked at her, his gaze kind and unblinking. He stopped being a tree, B.A. But he didn't stop being important. He just changed his job description. He went from standing tall to helping others get across. I think that's what happens to us when we feel like we've fallen. We're just becoming a bridge for something else. Or an apartment for mushrooms. Either way. It's a very noble transition. B.A. bit her lip, feeling the weight of the analogy settle into her bones. I feel a bit like I've fallen, Alistair. I don't feel like a bridge yet. I just feel horizontal. Horizontal is a very good position for thinking, Alistair pointed out cheerfully. And for napping. Never underestimate the power of a good nap to reorient the soul. Besides, you haven't fallen. You've just relocated. You've moved from the busy and loud chapter to the quiet and blues chapter. It's a much better place for character development. The dialogue is wittier. And the scenery is spectacular. He gestured towards the window again. The blue marigolds seemed to be glowing with an inner fire now, as if the darkness of the night was acting as a battery for their ethereal light. Look at them, he whispered. They've spent 7 years being nothing but green leaves and potential. They didn't worry about when they'd bloom. They didn't check their calendars. They just waited until the light was exactly right. And now, they're the only things in the world that look like that. You can't rush a miracle. B.A. It's statistically impossible. Miracles operate on a very strict when I'm ready policy. B.A. leaned her head against the back of the sofa, watching the flowers dance in the dark. For the first time in years, the voice in her head, the one that sounded like a ticking clock and a list of missed opportunities, was quiet. In its place was the sound of the wind, the purr of a ginger cat, and the gentle, nonsensical wisdom of a man who believed in the secret lives of trees. "I think I'd like to stay for a while," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If the offer of the chair still stands." Alistair didn't look at her, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch into a satisfied smile. "The chair has been missing you, B.A. It's been very lonely. It's had to put up with Barnaby's shed fur and my questionable poetry for far too long. It deserves a bit of company that doesn't smell of catnip and existential despair." He reached out and patted her hand again, a brief, warm connection that felt like coming home. "Stay as long as you like. The biscuits are plentiful, the tea is endless, and the 8th season is just around the corner. I've heard rumors that the roses might decide to sing this year, though that might just be the wind in the pipes. Either way, it'll be an adventure." B.A. closed her eyes, the scent of lavender, old paper, and chocolate wrapping around her like a blanket. The city felt like a dream she had woken up from, a loud, frantic dream that didn't matter anymore. Here, in the quiet heart of Oakhaven-on-the-Wold, life wasn't a race to the finish line. It was a cup of tea, a squeaky gate, and a garden full of blue flowers that knew exactly when to bloom, without ever needing to check the time. The first morning in Oakhaven-on-the-Wold felt less like a beginning and more like a gentle apology from the universe. B.A. woke to the sound of a wood pigeon staging a very polite protest outside her window. It wasn't the jagged, metallic screech of the London Underground or the insistent, angry beep of a courier van trapped in traffic. It was a soft, rhythmic cooing that seemed to say, "I'm here, and you're here, and neither of us has anywhere particularly urgent to be. Isn't that grand?" She lay there for a long time, watching a single dust mote perform a slow, intricate waltz in a shaft of sunlight. In the city, dust was an enemy, a sign of neglect, something to be wiped away with a sigh of irritation. Here, it looked like tiny fragments of a star that had decided to take a holiday. Everything felt different when you weren't trying to outrun your own shadow. When she finally ventured downstairs, the scent of toasted sourdough and something vaguely floral met her at the landing. Alistair was in the kitchen, engaged in a very serious conversation with a toaster that appeared to be older than the internet. "Now, listen here, Arthur," Alistair said, wagging a butter knife at the appliance. "We've discussed this. Consistency is the hallmark of a gentleman. One side golden, the other side equally golden. None of this burnt offering on the left, pale ghost on the right nonsense. We have a guest. Let's show some decorum." He looked up as B.A. entered, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "Ah, B.A. You've survived the night. I was worried the silence might have been too loud for you. Some people find the lack of sirens quite deafening at first." "I slept like a log, Alistair. Or perhaps like a bridge," she added, offering a small, shy smile. "Splendid. A bridge is much better. Logs just sit there, but bridges lead to things. Usually to the other side of a stream, which is a very underrated destination." He gestured toward a chair that was draped in a hand-knitted blanket of such vibrant, clashing colors it looked like a rainbow had had a very happy accident. "Sit. Tea is imminent. Arthur is currently considering his options regarding the bread." B.A. sat, feeling the warmth of the kitchen wrap around her. It was a cluttered room, filled with jars of unidentifiable preserves, stacks of gardening magazines, and a collection of ceramic frogs that seemed to be guarding the fruit bowl. It was messy, but it was a deliberate, loving kind of mess. It was the mess of a life being lived, rather than a life being curated for an audience. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," B.A. started, wrapping her hands around the chipped mug of Earl Grey he placed before her. "About the 7th season. And the marigolds. A dangerous pastime, thinking," Alistair remarked, finally coaxing 2 perfectly browned slices of toast from Arthur. "It often leads to conclusions, and conclusions are so very final. I prefer inklings. They're much more flexible. I feel like I've spent my whole life looking for the 8th season," B.A. said, her voice dropping. "I kept thinking that if I worked hard enough, or moved fast enough, I'd eventually arrive at a place where everything was. Finished. Where I was done. But looking at your garden, I realized that nothing is ever really done, is it? It's just waiting for the next thing to happen. Alistair sat down across from her, his expression softening. Exactly. People treat life like a jigsaw puzzle. They think they're looking for the final piece that will make the picture match the box. But there is no box, B.A. And the pieces keep changing shape. Sometimes you're a piece of the sky. And sometimes you're a piece of a muddy puddle. The trick is to enjoy being part of the picture, even when you're the mud. He took a large, crunching bite of toast. You see, the city teaches you that time is a thief. It's always taking things away, seconds, minutes, opportunities. But out here, time is a gardener. It takes its time, yes, but it's always planting something new. Even when it looks like winter. Things are happening in the dark. Very busy things. Worms are having meetings. Roots are stretching. It's a hive of unproductive productivity. Unproductive productivity, B.A. repeated, the words tasting strange and wonderful on her tongue. I think I've been addicted to the other kind. The kind that comes with spreadsheets and performance reviews. Terrible things, spreadsheets, Alistair shuddered. All those straight lines. Nature abhors a straight line. Have you ever seen a straight river? They're miserable things. They just want to get to the sea and get it over with. But a wiggly river. A wiggly river has character. It stops to talk to the reeds. It does a little loop-the-loop around a particularly interesting rock. It enjoys the journey. Be a wiggly river. B.A. It's much more fun, and you still get to the sea eventually. After breakfast, Alistair announced that they had very important business to attend to. This business, it turned out, involved walking to the village post office to buy a single stamp and a packet of lemon drops. Oakhaven-on-the-Wold was a village that seemed to have been designed by someone who believed that corners were meant for leaning against and that no wall was complete without a dusting of moss. As they walked, Alistair greeted everyone and everything they encountered. Morning, Mrs. Gable. How's the hip? Still singing in the rain? Good, good. Hello, Barnaby. No, not you. Cat, the other Barnaby. The oak tree. Looking very sturdy today, Barnaby. Keep up the good work. B.A. found herself giggling. Do you talk to all the trees, Alistair? Only the ones that look like they have something to say, he replied matter-of-factly. That oak is a gossip. He's been standing there since the Napoleonic Wars. He knows everything about everyone. If you listen closely, you can hear him tutting at the way people park their cars. They reached the post office, which also doubled as a general store, a library, and, apparently, the hub of the local intelligence service. A woman with a crown of silver curls and a pair of spectacles hanging from a beaded chain looked up from behind the counter. Alistair! I was beginning to think you'd been carried off by those blue marigolds of yours. And who is this lovely creature? Don't tell me you finally kidnapped a granddaughter. This is B.A., Mrs. Higgins. She's an old friend who has come to investigate the benefits of being horizontal. B.A., this is Mrs. Higgins. She knows what you're going to buy before you've even thought of it. It's a very unsettling talent. Mrs. Higgins beamed at B.A., her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. Welcome to the edge of the world, dear. It's a bit slow here, but that's only because we like to see where we're going. If you need anything, tea, sympathy, or the secret to a perfect Victoria sponge, you just come to me. Thank you, B.A. said, feeling a lump form in her throat. She had lived in her London apartment for 4 years and didn't even know her neighbour's last name. Here, within 10 minutes, she had been offered the secret to a sponge cake. As they walked back, the sun climbed higher, casting long, lazy shadows across the cobblestones. The air was thick with the scent of wild garlic and damp earth. You know, B.A. said, watching a bumblebee navigate a clump of foxgloves with drunken enthusiasm. I used to think that being happy was something you achieved. Like a promotion. I thought I'd reach a certain level of success, and then happiness would be unlocked, like a secret level in a video game. Alistair nodded, swinging his bag of lemon drops. A common misconception. Happiness isn't a destination, BA. It's a side effect. It's what happens when you're busy noticing the world. It's the feeling of a warm jumper on a cold day, or the way a cup of tea tastes when you've actually waited for the kettle to boil properly. It's very small. Usually. If you try to catch it with a net, it flies away. But if you sit very still and act like you're not interested, it might just land on your shoulder. They stopped by the stream, near the spot where the general had fallen. The old tree lay grandly across the water, its bark silvered by age and sun. A pair of ducks were perched on its trunk, looking very much like they were waiting for a bus. "Here's a very good bridge," B.A. whispered, touching the rough wood. "Here's a masterpiece," Alistair agreed. He failed at being a tree, you see. He couldn't stay upright anymore. Gravity won. But in failing to be a tree, he became something much more useful to the ducks. There's a lesson in there somewhere, probably involving the importance of falling over gracefully. But I'm too old for lessons. I prefer stories. "Tell me a story then," B.A. said, sitting down on the grassy bank. Alistair sat beside her, his knees creaking in a way that sounded like an old door. Once upon a time, there was a girl who thought she was a clock. She spent all her time ticking and tacking, making sure every second was accounted for. She was very precise, very reliable, and very, very tired. She thought that if she stopped ticking, the world would stop turning. But one day, she forgot to wind herself up. She sat down in a garden, and she waited for the end of the world. He paused, watching the water ripple over the stones. "And?" B.A. asked. "And the world didn't stop. The sun still came up. The birds still sang. The flowers still grew. And the girl realized that the world didn't need her to tick. It just needed her to be there to see it. So she stopped being a clock and started being a flower. She didn't have to do anything anymore. She just had to bloom when she was ready. And she found that blooming was much less exhausting than ticking." B.A. looked down at her hands. They were empty. No phone, no watch, no frantic list of things to do. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The silence was full enough on its own. "I think I'm starting to grow some petals," she said softly. Alistair chuckled and handed her a lemon drop. "Careful. Once you start blooming, it's very hard to stop. You might find yourself turning into a perennial. Or worse, a shrub. Shrubs have a very easy life, you know. No one expects a shrub to have a 5-year plan." They sat in silence for a long time, two people and a fallen tree, watching the day unfold at its own leisurely pace. The busy and loud chapter of B.A.'s life was fading, the ink blurring into a soft, watercolor wash. In its place, a new chapter was being written, one with wider margins, simpler words, and plenty of space for the wind to blow through the pages. "Alistair?" "Yes, B.A.? Do you think the blue marigolds will still be there tomorrow?" Alistair looked toward the cottage, where the blue glow was beginning to flicker as the afternoon light shifted. "I suspect they'll be there as long as you need them to be. Flowers are very intuitive like that. They know when someone is watching. They like the attention. It makes them feel like they're doing a good job." "They are," B.A. said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "They're doing a wonderful job." As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised plum and apricot, B.A. felt a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. It wasn't the palpitations of anxiety she was used to. It was something lighter, something that felt remarkably like hope. Perhaps the 8th season wasn't a time of year at all. Perhaps it was just the moment when you finally stopped trying to be somewhere else and realized that where you were was exactly where you were meant to be. Surrounded by blue flowers, eccentric old men, and the quiet, persistent wisdom of trees that had learned how to fall. "I think I'm ready for that nap now," B.A. murmured. Excellent, Alistair replied. The sofa is warmed up, and Barnaby has promised not to sit on your face for at least 20 minutes. It's practically a luxury retreat. And as they walked back toward the little cottage with the blue garden, the world felt perfectly, beautifully, and most importantly, wigglily right. The walk back to the cottage felt different from the walk away from it. The gravel path beneath BA's boots didn't crunch with the same impatient rhythm it had only 2 hours ago. Now, each step was a deliberate choice, a soft conversation between her souls and the earth. Beside her, Alistair hummed a tune that sounded suspiciously like a nursery rhyme played at half speed, his walking stick clicking a steady, comforting beat against the stones. You know, Alistair said, stopping to inspect a particularly unremarkable hedge, dust is a very misunderstood substance. People spend their whole lives trying to get rid of it. But I've always thought of it as the universe's way of keeping things warm. A house without dust is a house that's trying too hard. It's a house that doesn't know how to relax. B.A. smiled, a genuine, unhurried expression that felt as though it were reawakening muscles in her face she hadn't used in years. Is that why you haven't dusted your mantelpiece since the Great Fire of London? Precisely, he said, tapping the hedge with his stick. I'm providing a thermal blanket for my knickknacks. It's an act of charity, really. Besides, if you wipe away the dust, you might accidentally wipe away a memory. And memories are much harder to put back than grit. They reached the gate, the one that creaked in a minor key, and stepped back into the sanctuary of the blue garden. The marigolds were even more vibrant now that the sun was dipping lower, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched across the lawn like the fingers of a weary giant. The blue didn't fade in the twilight, instead, it seemed to deepen, absorbing the indigo of the approaching evening. Go on then, Alistair said, ushering her toward the front door. The sofa is waiting. It's been feeling very neglected all afternoon. I believe it's developed a bit of a sulk. Inside, the cottage smelled of dried lavender, toasted bread, and the peculiar, comforting scent of old paper. It was a smell that suggested that nothing urgent had happened here for at least 40 years, and nothing urgent was planned for the next 40. B.A. kicked off her boots, not placing them neatly by the door as she usually would, but letting them land where they fell, and padded into the sitting room. The sofa was a mountain of velvet cushions and knitted throws. It was the sort of furniture that didn't just support you, it consumed you in a friendly, grandmotherly sort of way. As B.A. lowered herself onto it, she felt the tension in her shoulders finally, mercifully, snap. It wasn't a painful break, but a release, like a tightly wound spring finally giving up its energy. Barnaby, the ginger cat who acted as the cottage's self-appointed sovereign, appeared from behind a curtain. He regarded B.A. with a look of profound judgment, his whiskers twitching as he calculated the exact coordinates of her lap. With a soft thud, he launched himself onto her chest, circling 3 times before collapsing into a heavy, purring heap. He likes you, Alistair called from the kitchen, the sound of a whistling kettle beginning to rise. Either that, or he's mistaken you for a very large, warm piece of furniture. It's hard to tell with Barnaby. He has very high standards for upholstery. B.A. closed her eyes. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't think about the emails sitting in her inbox like unexploded landmines. She didn't think about the spreadsheets, the deadlines, or the terrifyingly blank pages of her future. She thought about the blue marigolds. She thought about the ducks on the fallen tree. She thought about how the world was very big and very old, and how she was very small and very new, and how that was perfectly, wonderfully all right. The nap wasn't just a nap. It was a voyage. She dreamt of a city made of clocks, where everyone carried a giant golden key to wind themselves up every hour. In the dream, she had lost her key. She stood in the middle of a frantic square, watching people scurrying past, their ticking sounds creating a deafening roar. She waited for her heart to stop, for her limbs to freeze, for the end of the world to arrive because she could no longer keep time. But as her ticking slowed and finally ceased, something strange happened. The stone pavement beneath her feet turned into soft, damp moss. The skyscrapers dissolved into towering oaks. The golden keys fell from the hands of the people and turned into butterflies. When she woke up, the room was bathed in the soft, purple glow of dusk. The kettle was no longer whistling, replaced by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that no longer felt like a countdown, but like a heartbeat. Alistair was sitting in a winged armchair across from her, a book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading it. He was watching the window, where the first stars were beginning to poke holes in the velvet sky. "You've been gone for 3 hours," he said softly, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You missed a very dramatic sunset." The sky turned the color of a bruised peach. It was quite scandalous. B.A. sat up, Barnaby grumbling at the loss of his pillow. She felt light. She felt as though her bones had been replaced with balsa wood. "I didn't mean to sleep so long." "Nonsense," Alistair replied, handing her a mug of tea that was exactly the right shade of tan. Time is a very flexible thing in the 8th season. An hour can be a lifetime, or a lifetime can be an afternoon. It all depends on how much tea you're drinking. I've often found that a good digestive biscuit can slow down the rotation of the earth by several seconds. B.A. took a sip of the tea. It was hot and sweet and tasted of safety. "Alistair? Why are the flowers blue?" "Really?" The old man leaned back, his eyes twinkling in the shadows. "Well, if you want the scientific answer, I haven't the foggiest. Some nonsense about soil acidity and a rogue packet of seeds from a botanist with a sense of humor. I expect. But if you want the real answer, they're blue because they decided that being orange was a bit too loud for this particular garden. They wanted to match the sky at twilight. They wanted to be something that made people stop and wonder, rather than just something they recognized." He paused, looking at his own weathered hands. "We spend so much time trying to be the thing the seed packet says we are. A marigold must be orange. A girl must be successful. A man must be useful. But sometimes, the soil changes. Sometimes the rain falls differently. And if you're brave enough to let yourself change with it, you might find you've turned into something much more interesting than what was printed on the box." B.A. looked out at the garden. The flowers were ghosts now, pale blue spectres in the dark. She thought about her life in London, the polished shoes, the sharp suits, the way she had curated her personality like a high-end showroom. It all felt very far away, like a film she had watched a long time ago and couldn't quite remember the plot of. "I don't think I can go back," she whispered. "Not to the way it was. But I don't know where else to go." Alistair reached over and patted her hand. His skin was like parchment, but his grip was surprisingly firm. "The wonderful thing about being lost, B.A., is that you're no longer on a path. And when you're not on a path, you can go in any direction you like. You could go left. You could go right. You could sit down and wait for the moss to grow over your boots. There is no wrong way to be a person." He stood up, his joints protesting with their usual repertoire of creaks. "Now, I believe there's a tin of shortbread in the kitchen that's been calling my name. It's very insistent. Shortbread has a very loud ego." As he shuffled away, B.A. picked up her phone from the side table. It had been off for 3 days. She looked at the black screen, her own reflection staring back at her. She looked tired, yes, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She pressed the power button. The device hummed to life, vibrating instantly with a barrage of notifications. Missed calls. Urgent emails. Text messages demanding to know where she was, why she hadn't responded, when she would be back. She looked at the digital chaos for a moment, the blue light of the screen clashing harshly with the gentle indigo of the room. Then, with a thumb that didn't tremble, she swiped through the settings. She didn't delete the apps. She didn't throw the phone out of the window, though the thought was tempting. Instead, she simply turned it back off. The silence that rushed back into the room was magnificent. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the world was breathing. The trees were swaying, the river was flowing, and the blue marigolds were resting, preparing to bloom again in the morning. They didn't have a strategy. They didn't have a brand. They just were. "I'm staying for another week," she said to the empty room, or perhaps to Barnaby, who had reclaimed the sofa. "Maybe 2. Maybe until the 9th season starts, whatever that might be." Alistair appeared in the doorway, a shortbread biscuit in each hand. "The 9th season is mostly about learning to appreciate the specific music made by leaky gutters," he said, handing her a biscuit. "It's a very advanced level of existence. But I think you're a natural." B.A. took a bite of the biscuit. It was buttery and crumbled perfectly, a tiny, edible masterpiece. She felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye, not a tear of sadness, but one of those rare, shimmering drops that come when the heart finally finds its own rhythm. She wasn't a clock anymore. She wasn't ticking. She wasn't even blooming yet, not quite. She was just a seed, tucked away in the cool, dark earth, waiting for the right kind of rain. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't in any hurry at all to see what she would become. "Is it supposed to be this quiet?" she asked, her voice thick with wonder. Alistair smiled, his face a map of 1,000 stories, all with happy endings. "No, my dear. It's not quiet. You're just finally listening." Outside, the wind whispered through the blue petals, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of a tomorrow that didn't need to be conquered, only lived. The 8th season had arrived, and B.A. was exactly where she needed to be, nowhere in particular, and everywhere at once. The kettle began to hum again, a low, contented sound, and as the moon rose over the crooked roof of the cottage, the world continued to turn, perfectly, beautifully, and most importantly, wigglily. B.A. took another bite of her biscuit, sat back down on the sulking sofa, and began to tell Barnaby a story about a girl who forgot to wind herself up, and how, in the end, she found that the sun came up just fine without her help. It was a very good story. And for the first time, B.A. knew exactly how it ended. It ended with a beginning.